We're live.
Good afternoon. This is the Senate Education Committee on February 20th, 1:15, or supposed to be a couple minutes late. We're starting today taking a look at demographics and thinking about as we look ahead and think about the work that we're doing this year, trying to get a sense of what we should be expecting in terms of school-age children. There's a lot of factors that go into that. And we'll go around the table and introduce ourselves and let you introduce yourself. We'll start with the NPC over there. So when she comes, it'll be Keisha Senator Romney.
Hi, I'm Nader Hashim from Windham County. Nice to meet you. Hi.
Good afternoon, Dave Weeks, representing Rutland County.
Seth Bongartz, Bennington Senate District.
Terry Williams, Rutland District.
And Steve Heffernan, Edison County District.
Yeah, then you.
Nice to meet you all. My name is Kevin Chu, Executive Director of the Vermont Futures Project. Thank you for having me here today to speak about demographics and the impact on education. And I'll share my screen and dive into the conversation. So before I get into the slides and the data, I'll expand on my introduction a bit to share who I am, the perspective that I bring to the work. I grew up in Vermont. I look forward to growing old here too. My parents immigrated from Southeast China back in 1986, ended up in this great state of all places because they had one social connection to the United States. I have an aunt who married an American. They happen to have a home in Vermont. That's how we ended up here. My parents left behind everything they knew, took a brave leap of faith in their mid-20s to come to a place where they didn't speak the language. They didn't have college degrees, but they were in search of economic opportunity. And I'm so thankful, I feel privileged to say they found it here. They were able to find jobs. They were able to raise their boys, put them through college. They realized their American dream. So I share that because the work of the Futures Project is to answer this mission question, which is how can we use data to support the evolution of Vermont's economy toward the thriving future full of opportunity for all. And it's that opportunity word that I really feel connected to in terms of carrying out this mission. And certainly when we think of education, that it's a pathway for opportunity for many, many people. So how are we answering this mission question? Over the past 2 years, I have been traveling around the state. I've had the privilege of connecting directly with over 5,000 Vermonters across all 14 counties to understand what are their challenges, what are the opportunities they see in their communities, what are their hopes, dreams, and ambitions for the future of this state. And then critically, how do we get there? This work has led to the development of our economic action plan. I believe each of you have received copies in your mailboxes, but I have extras here just in case. As I mentioned, that public engagement was an opportunity for me to learn from Vermonters, and the themes that you see here on the screen are some of the themes that popped up in that engagement process. I don't think any of these words or phrases will come as a surprise to you all, but certainly affordability and cost of living were top of mind, are still top of mind for many, many Vermonters. So from this, as I mentioned, we developed our economic action plan, which is focused on the frameworks of people and places, specifically demographics and housing. And we've set some long-term aspirational goals to grow the population, especially the working age population, to 802,000 by 2035. And I'll explain how we calculated that. We didn't just pick it because of the area code. And then in order to achieve that level of growth, certainly we need a level of housing expansion to make that possible. At the same time, there's efficiency strategies, things we can do with what we already have, both in terms of existing infrastructure, streamlining some of the processes that are slowing down housing construction. And then from a workforce perspective, how do we increase labor force participation? So that's an outline of the high level goals in the plan, and the strategies are clustered into both expansion and efficiency. Now, this plan is really about connecting the dots. As we all engage with our neighbors, as we read the news, listen to the radio, we hear about the symptoms, the challenges that people are feeling, whether it's workforce or housing or healthcare. education, certainly, in terms of education, finance, property taxes, childcare, affordability. Again, these are all symptoms, and this plan tries to address root causes that are creating these symptoms. Again, back to those frameworks of people and places, I'll focus in on the people framework and talk about demographics, and we'll go to the places framework in the second half of my presentation. So I want to start with this quote from the Legislative Joint Fiscal Office. An aging population implies lower tax revenues per capita, all else being equal. This was from a report they issued on Vermont's demographics. This was 2 years ago when the report was issued, and we've only gotten older since then. Unless a Vermonter 65 and older decide to leave Vermont in droves, or younger working age people flock to the state in great numbers, Vermont's ratio of older residents to working age people will continue to rise, placing a greater burden on workers to support both young and old. I'm going from the quote to what that looks like in data. One of the metrics that is in this plan is dependency ratio. So it's a ratio of working age people relative to the number of children and elderly, so 65 plus. And as we can see here, this ratio has increased over time. But the composition of that ratio, when we break it apart to look at the subcomponents, old age ratio and child ratio, we can see that there are fewer children than seniors in our state. So to drill even further into those details, this is the distribution of Vermont's population by age from the year 2000. Pains me to say that was 25 years ago. Now, what you can see is, again, that relatively large working age population compared to the number of children and elderly. And in that year, in the year 2000, we had about 226,000 Vermonters between the ages of 25 to 49. That's our workforce. That's our tax base. And in terms of where things are now, this is the picture. So we have almost 30,000 fewer people in that 25 to 49 cohort. And then the number of 65 plus Vermonters has nearly doubled. At the same time, the fertility rate in Vermont is at the lowest of any state in the country. So our homegrown talent supply, the number of kids enrolled in our school system, has declined significantly. And I'll quantify what that is in the next few slides. So yeah, how that translates from demographics and the age distribution into public school enrollment. We've seen a decline of over 20,000 students enrolled in our K-12 system over the past 20 years. And then when it's projected out to 2031, 2032, based on data from the National Center for Education Statistics, that's going to continue to go down, right? That's the result, sort of that lag time of a low fertility rate. I've also compiled some data, which you can see on the map, of estimated latent capacity. So this is a measure of enrollment peaks versus current enrollment. Any area that's blue or green on the map has fewer students in their school system today than they did at one point over the past 20 years. This can help us visualize where there's extra space in classrooms, or there's extra space in school buildings, because that total number has gone down. And it can be a helpful way to think about how to plan growth.
It's interesting about this slide, just to point it out, as you like 2024, you're showing 80,000. We actually had about 80. We actually have about 85,000. What doesn't pick up is the kids in independent schools. It's pretty interesting because they're actually part of the actual population. Because my understanding is we have about 85,000 kids in the system.
Which is the population in the independent schools has remained rather steady.
Yes,
Why?
look at me, relatively steady.
Yeah.
So it's just that this focuses only on public school enrollment, so it misses a cohort of Vermont kids.
Yeah.
Not
The overall trend is still down.
I understand.
And yeah, when we look ahead to
reconcile that 80,000 when I saw it.
exactly, this is focused on public school. So this data comes from the Agency of Education, and then I've merged it with the projections from the National Center of Education Statistics to get a feel for where we might be in the next 10 years. And again, it's a reflection of that low fertility rate. So the number of kids in our school system will continue to decrease if trends hold steady, which means higher per pupil cost as well.
So just to note, I'm interested that the trend line, while it's lower, in 2030 it's 3,000 kids less, so it's not as, I just wanted to, doing thoughts about that. I would have expected it to be more, frankly. Fewer kids.
Well, some thoughts is we've actually seen a bit of in-migration recently that has helped to grow Vermont's population. And over the past 3 years, a lot of that in-migration has been from folks in their 30s and 40s with school-age kids. So it may be picking up on some of these pre versus post-pandemic trends in the long-term projections. But that is a good point in that data is helpful insofar that it gives us an idea of what might happen based on what has happened. But I think there's a powerful story for us to walk away with, which is data isn't destiny. And if we don't like where the trend lines are going, we can make different decisions, reconfigure our processes, and put ourselves on a different trajectory. So going from demographics to labor force, I think it's important to understand the role that our education system plays in terms of contributing to our overall workforce and what that does to either close the gap or understand the limitations as well. From a workforce supply and demand perspective, the largest driver on the demand side is retirements. So those are, it's about 17,150 people per year estimated to leave the workforce, according to the Vermont Department of Labor. To contextualize that number, we have about 5,300 12th grade students across the entire state of Vermont, right? And we don't retain 100% of them. So even if we retained every high school kid and they went into the workforce or stayed in Vermont for college, and then let's say we also increased college graduate retention to near 100%, we would still need some level of net inbound migration to close this workforce gap. That's the impact of our current demographic mix, which is why this plan focuses on both efficiency, right, increasing that retention rate, and expansion. It's a yes and, it's not an either or. We have to do both.
It's a question on the, can you go back one,
Yes.
please? Job growth is a negative number.
So it means it's adding to demand if more job openings become available, right? Then the gap of available workers to the amount of work available increases.
Okay.
All right, so if there's a new job opening, but we don't have enough people, then that gap is growing. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Great clarifying question. So to fill this gap, we need about 13,500 people entering the workforce each year. Some of that can be filled with folks who are already here. Some of that should also be filled by folks coming from elsewhere. And again, this is why we've outlined both efficiency and expansion. Efficiency means increasing labor force participation. That's the green line on this chart, but you can only increase it to the extent that you have people in that age cohort. So we also need to be able to increase the blue line as well, to increase the working age population. This is a very unbalanced chart. So back to connecting the dots, we'll look at the places framework for a bit and then open it up to a discussion. Certainly when we think about the feasibility of increasing our working age population, housing becomes a constraint. And looking at the historical overview of the housing data, what we see is Vermont has some of the oldest housing stock in the country. About a quarter of the homes were built before 1940, pre-World War II. Then there were relatively high rates of new construction through the 70s and 80s. That was a time when the interstate expanded and there was this back to the land movement and quite a bit of population growth into Vermont. But in recent decades, we've seen new housing construction slow significantly to the point where less than 20% of Vermont's housing stock has been built in the last 20 years.
Wow.
Now, going from this data to thinking about how this fits into an education context, with property taxes being one of the funding sources for education. If we're slowing down the construction of new housing, we're sort of limiting the growth of that potential funding. Right. Right now, Vermont ranks third overall in the country in terms of per capita tax collections. Right, so we can either try to squeeze more out of a limited number of homes and people, or we can think about that expansion strategy and try to grow the tax base.
How current is that number?
This one?
Yes.
Yeah, this is from 2023.
So we could have moved into number one by now.
Perhaps, yeah, there's a little bit of a lag time with the US Census Bureau data. That's the source for this. The last time I checked, 2023 was the latest data set that they had available. But certainly as soon as new data become available, I'll be publishing that.
New Hampshire, all the way on the right. We all have to collect taxes to run essential services and such. So this isn't just state sales tax, etc. This is all taxes.
That's right.
But still, New Hampshire is all the way out on the extreme.
Mhm. Yeah, and I've highlighted in blue the other New England states.
Nice.
That's right. Twice as many people in about the same land area.
And everybody goes to New Hampshire, Sean.
No. Yeah, some.
All good with this slide? So discussion about this data here. This is latent capacity in terms of population on a town by town level. So there has been population growth in Vermont. Our population has gone up, but that growth hasn't happened in an evenly distributed manner. And when we take a look at where growth has happened, all the areas that are blue and green on this map have depopulated, while the areas that are a lighter shade are where growth have happened. So we see that clustered in and around Chittenden County and certainly some of the resort towns. What this means, though, is that when we take a look at potential for future growth, some of that is just tapping into existing capacity and revitalization. If a town at one point had 5,000 people and they only have 3,000 now, there may be some infrastructure in place to accommodate growth or revitalization back to a historical peak.
So capacity meaning homes, empty school seats.
This
What
is looking just at population. So it's a simple calculation between historical peak population and current. At the local level, that may look different. Some towns, it might mean there are vacant homes and those homes might not even be fit for occupation right now. In other areas, it might mean median household size has gone down and you have empty bedrooms where one or two adults are occupying a large home that has 4 or 5 bedrooms.
Is the historical peak population different for every county? For us as a story?
It is. This data goes back to 1800. So the exact peak for each town is different. And what I was trying to quantify was just how far from that peak are we now to get a feel for where there might be capacity for growth and revitalization. Certainly the next phase of research to take this to the next level is go do some ground truthing. What are the conditions in these places that are blue and green? What is the potential there? But I needed to start with a statewide assessment to just get our bearings. But the takeaway for me when looking at this is that I've heard folks say Vermont doesn't have the carrying capacity for growth. That the comment has been made towards me multiple times because of the Work of the Futures project. And I think that when we make that statement in aggregate, it misses the local perspective in which some towns desperately want to grow because they've experienced degrowth. So it was a data informed way to just have a more nuanced conversation rather than saying Vermont can't grow.
It's one of the reasons that last year in Act 181, we said that towns have to allow for 4 stories. If you have no button, you get a lot more bang for your buck and more people with less space.
So yeah, it's about having
Yeah.
data and
Yeah.
and information that empower local communities to make the best decision for themselves.
So looking at the majority of the white there, that's Addison County. And is that because of people moving out of Chittenden County into Addison County?
We've started to see that where folks can't find a home
Right.
in, let's say, Burlington, South Burlington, and they live a little farther out, and that's impacting not only Addison, but Franklin County
Yeah.
as well.
St. Albans has really benefited from.
But there are environmental impacts to this too. It means people are driving a little bit farther to access work, access services. Again, data can be helpful in guiding where we build, how we build, and it gets past that yes or no and allows us to actually ask how. So to quantify what is the need, there's a statewide housing needs assessment released in fall of 2024 that said Vermont needs to add about 24 to 36,000 new homes over the next 5 years, 24,000 being the low end based on pre-pandemic growth. But again, we know that the census data reflects that there was a lot of inbound migration and demand for Vermont remains elevated. So to meet that post-pandemic demand and rate of growth, 36,000 was the high end of that estimate. And I've broken apart the components of what went into that 36,000 estimate here on this slide. So I want to go from that overall number to thinking about this in terms of an annual rate.
So just to make sure I understand the slide, is the 36,000 just if nobody was even trying to move here? We have that much of an issue right now with the population of Vermont as it exists, or does this anticipate? I know the vacancy, normalizing the vacancy rate, I understand that.
Yeah.
So which is it? Is it both people who want to come as well as people who are, yeah, okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
Can I ask a question in a different way?
sure.
Do the current economic growth or let's say growth indicators support the need for this volume of housing?
Certainly when we think about housing and workforce in tandem, right? So to fill that workforce gap from earlier, we do need this level of new housing construction. Now, some things could change. Perhaps some of those open jobs, companies might say, well, I'm having trouble filling them here. Maybe I'll try to fill them elsewhere. And then that workforce gap grows because that job opening went away. Or maybe companies double down and they say, I really am committed to Vermont and I want to grow here. This number may go up. So this is based on current conditions. And I do think it is important to position the workforce conversation and the housing conversation together.
Sorry if you already covered this. Can you explain why there's the differentiation between meeting the existing demand pre-pandemic and then pandemic era demand in 2 separate colors?
Mhm.
Sorry.
Yeah, so the lower number, that 24,000 meeting the pre-pandemic demand, was based on the rate of population growth and household growth before the pandemic. And if Vermont had continued at that same level of very small growth, we still would have needed 24,000 new homes to meet the needs of current Vermonters prior to the pandemic. Then with the increased interest in folks relocating to Vermont, the blue that gets us to the 36,000 says, okay, we have to also create space to meet that demand. Otherwise, what that does is increased demand puts pressure on the existing housing ecosystem.
And then the prices go.
Exactly, and that's the downstream effect. When there's increased demand and constrained supply, everyone's feeling it in terms of housing prices. But the fact that housing prices remain elevated is actually a positive indicator that demand persists, which is a very, in my mind, it's a better position to be in as a state where people want to be here than the opposite of that. Right. And actually, less than a decade ago, we think about the pre-pandemic conditions. As a state, we had a relocation incentive. We were trying to figure out, well, how do we get people interested in moving here? Today, we have a very different dynamic, which in my mind is a better position to be in.
This is anecdotal, but when COVID hit, we have a couple lakes around in our district. And they've all, they're summer homes, a lot of them are just seasonal. And when COVID hit, in the winter months, and we got snowed in, and there were so many cars at these camps where the families had actually moved out of the cities because most of them are second homes. That they were all staying there because they wanted to get away from COVID.
Right.
So then, next summer, seasonal the contractors in my town, you couldn't get one because they were all down at the lake doing renovations to camps because people were making them permanent housing.
That's right.
So it was kind of funny how that happened.
Yeah.
And now you're looking for a contractor in my town, you gotta go out of state to find it.
That's a story across most of Vermont right now.
Yeah.
So if you take this premise and match it to the latency, the statewide latency, where are these housing demands positioned? Like, are they? It's
Yeah,
not
so-
uniformly.
Exactly. The 36,000 wouldn't be, okay, let's divide it by 14 and split it up by county. In some areas, let's say, if we go back to this map here, in the Burlington metropolitan area, there's a data set that I want to point you towards in the economic plan. It's towards the end under the section of smart growth. So it's a map that shows the ratio of jobs to homes. And what we see is the clusters of blue are where there are more jobs than homes, meaning people are commuting towards those places on a day-to-day basis. And then the areas that are lighter shaded on this map are where there are a lot of homes and fewer economic opportunities. So this is another data layer that we can lay on top of this housing needs assessment to say, okay, if one of the goals is to not only create more homes, but help people live closer to where they live, or sorry, live closer to where they work, and create denser, compact communities that are also enable us to make progress on our climate goals by reducing vehicle miles traveled. That jobs to homes ratio is a good way to think about how to distribute this 36,000.
So in your research, like, have you overlaid the two or even the three factors of distance to work? So this is where we need to build based on lack of latency, job demands, and keeping people closer to their work sites.
I haven't yet. I've spent much of the past 2 years just
Okay, no, that's
yeah,
fine.
no, it's a great question, and it's one that I've been thinking about, and it could be the subject of a research study this coming year to go beyond, okay, here's the 36,000 statewide level, and I want to get more detailed at the local level. One of the ongoing projects for our organization is to take some of the statewide data and create regional dashboards. Inevitably, when I travel around the state and give presentations, that is a question that comes up, right? When I talk about the housing needs, or when I talk about workforce needs and I show the demographic distribution, one of the questions I always get is, well, what does it look like in my county? Or what does it look like in my town? So that is the next phase of work for the Futures Project.
Because we could have some false starts. You know, we have a lot of politicians who all want to correct the perceived housing problem in their area, but that may not be, really that may not be the best investment. Best investment may be whatever the data provides, say these areas are the hotspots.
Yeah.
We may be investing in the wrong areas.
Yeah, I would suggest that some of the data contained in this plan would be a good starting point, and I agree that more research is needed. Some data is better than no data.
No, this is good.
So I mentioned from this number, what I want us to focus on is the annual rate. How do we get to this 36,000, or how do we get to some of these longer term goals? 36,000 over 5 years is about 7,200 per year. And right now we're building about 2,500 per year, according to the building permits data. So we're very far off pace. This number would need to nearly triple in order to meet our stated housing needs. Right. Permits issued. Yeah, I want to restate that word with a slightly different pronunciation. Permit, as in permission, as in this is how many we allow. So on the one hand, we say we need 7,200 per year, but our systems and processes only allow for a third of what is needed.
What couldn't that, isn't that also a factor of, isn't that the unit per minute is a factor of how many applications go in?
It's the time it takes to process and it's the cost. I think there are some proposals that never get submitted because of the perceived bureaucratic barriers that may be in the way. This could also reflect appeals that folks face. So this is just one number, but there are a lot of factors that play a role. And then there's also the intersection of state level regulations and local level, and sometimes they're duplicative. For me, this number helps us to keep score,
Yeah,
because if we say we need 7,200, but we only permit 2,500.
but there's not to be the source, but a assumption underlying there that the number of units per minute is only because of regulatory barriers, when in fact it may just be because nobody's looking to build the units because you can't make money, or there's difficulty making money even without. So I think I would accept that it's a number of a lot of factors.
I agree. Yeah, I think whether it's friction within the system or the lack of applications coming in,
Yeah.
this is the score.
Yeah. Okay. Fair.
And it doesn't put us on pace to meet what we say we need. So I'll wrap up by saying that this economic action plan is meant to put Vermont on a pathway towards affordability and abundance. Going back to all those challenges, the symptoms that I heard from Vermonters over the past 2 years, we can categorize the sentiment into three main buckets. I'll get to that on the next page. But I want to take a step back and reframe the overall targets in terms of incremental progress. And again, back to a rate, what is the level of growth that's needed to get to 802,000 by 2035? It would only take 2% growth per year. That means if you live in a town of 1,000 people, how do you welcome 20 new residents next year? It's a very different conversation. And I think we have to be able to take some of these aspirational statewide goals and again, have local conversations to think about the practical steps. What's the next best thing we can do? So the three categories of sentiment that I heard were, I want ample services, I want low density, I want low cost of living. And Vermont right now is at the intersection of the blue and the green. We have a lot of services and programs. So we also have low population density, and the result is high cost of living. So as Vermonters have voiced, they want the state to be more affordable. We have a choice to make as a state. How do we want to achieve that? We can take an abundance approach or a scarcity approach. Scarcity conversations are already playing out in many of our communities. That's the school consolidation conversation. It's proposed cuts to hospital services or even downright closures, right? And that could reduce costs in the short term, but I think there are potential long-term consequences to those choices as well. The other option is to embrace an abundance pathway. It's to see people as the solution. That means accelerating housing growth and bringing more working age people here, fill up our schools that have latent capacity, grow the tax base rather than growing the taxes. So. And then,
Everybody take into consideration the, looking into the future, all the fires in California, building materials are gonna go there. What we get here is gonna go up. So it's gonna be cost. I mean, I built a house, my first house in, 1976, and it cost me, I had to borrow $27,000 to do it. But I built it myself because I was a contractor.
sure.
And now, I mean, you're talking $350,000 for a modest house. You know,
Mhm.
because you have,
So in the plan, we try to break apart the components of the cost of housing, because just looking at that overall number can be very overwhelming. And we take a look at the 5 Ls, so land, labor, lumber, lending, and the laws. So those are components that we touch on within the plan itself. And then we take a step back and ask, okay, what do we have control over as a state? Certainly something like the federal interest rates impacts the cost of housing, but we don't have control over that.
Right.
So we try to focus our time and attention and energy on the levers that we do have control over to try to bring down. I'll also piggyback on your comment by saying some of those wildfires that are happening is one of the reasons why I think demand for Vermont will persist and may even go up.
yeah.
Because there are folks in California that might not want to rebuild and are looking for a place to relocate to. And one of the things I say a lot is, from an economic perspective, we can see Vermont needs more people, but we also have to tell the story that more people need Vermont.
And the people in California talking about Vermont's asbestos forest. We haven't had serious forest fires since 1967. So,
So demand for Vermont might go up, but we should proactively be planning for that and expand the capacity to meet that demand.
Do you ever have just interviews or one-on-one conversations with folks who want to move to Vermont but are unable to for whatever reason?
I have had a few one-on-one conversations with folks. I think you can see a lot of examples of this actually on public forums. There was a flurry of interest in relocating to Vermont shortly after the national elections in November. If you go on to Reddit r/Vermont and just search for moving to Vermont or relocating to Vermont, you can see the numerous perspectives. There's definitely still interest. The few individuals I've spoken with, they talk about job opportunities and housing.
Yeah, the reason I ask is, I mean, I'm 36, I have a number, of friends from college who are around my age, and there's a number of them who, have come to visit Vermont, and they, often talk about wanting to move here, but then, they look at the housing stock, or, many of them also depend on the internet
tax.
for their, to do their work. And so, when they're confronted with a lot of these things that they don't have, that they can't access, it's definitely a roadblock to.
Yeah. We have to be able to close that gap between want and need. And if we take a look at the national level data on state to state migration, in recent years, there's a very clear trend of movement of people away from higher cost of living states towards lower cost of living states. When they're not coming here. And actually, some of that is into Vermont, but it's from higher cost of living states. Right? Vermont ranks about 7th right now in terms of highest cost of living, which means there are 6 states with higher cost of living than Vermont. And those folks, if they relocate here, actually might think Vermont is relatively affordable compared to where they're coming from.
So I think the by one vote density piece is a big factor there.
I think it is too. It's sentiment I encounter a lot.
It's why we did some things over the last few years with zoning changes, something areas with municipal water have to allow 5 units an acre. They have to allow buildings to go 4 stories, and you get that story if you So we did, and the by right provisions in the law that we passed a couple of years ago, it's trying to get at some of that, but
Yeah.
and trying to make it possible to build denser in places that it truly makes sense. And I also think a lot of people want to live in that environment. Not everybody, but a lot do, where they can walk to work, the whole thing you were talking about. So,
Exactly.
so we're trying.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
I'm sure you've probably encountered the sentiment that if we grow the population, if we increase housing, it may turn Vermont into New Jersey. And I've heard that many, many times. Don't Jersey, Vermont.
Yeah.
And I'll end with a little bit of data. So Vermont is about 70 people per square mile today. New Jersey's 1,200 people per square mile. If we grow to 802,000, we go from 70 to 87. We would have, our state population would have to reach 11 million
if we're strategic
before we
about
become
it,
New Jersey.
if we're strategic about it all, we can put it in places where it's really gonna create vibrancy
And it can be good for the environment
and good for the environment. So,
and the economy.
so talk to us a little bit about one of the, we're doing this in part because we're thinking about school age demographics. I think actually touched on it. But yeah, you showed you showed, this is our key takeaway, I think, for today, is that you showed a slight decline in school age children over the next, what was it, 7 or 8 years?
So I can go back to that.
And as you said, data is not destiny. So
Correct.
keep that in mind as well.
Yeah.
But
It can tell us what will likely happen if we maintain the status quo.
so, Senator, you'll be interested in this, because this chart here,
Yeah,
this shows the number, and by the way, it's only public, so it leaves out the independents and the kids who are tuition,
Mhm.
because it's just public, the 80,000. But nevertheless, the point is the same. But it shows, our question was, what are we headed toward? And at this point, it's showing about a 3,000 student decline
Yeah.
over the next 5 years. What do you call that? 5 years, 6 years?
6, yeah. And it's a reflection again of our current demographics, the fact that we have the lowest fertility rate of any state in the country.
So in that respect, I mean, sticking to education. Being that we know the population bands here by year, why can't that school age population be extrapolated out another 5 years, 10 years? Kind of a little further view, no?
We could, the farther we get, the more the margin of error increases. But if I were to draw a dotted line, it would continue to go down.
If all things, okay, so if all status quo, the same trend would continue.
Yeah.
Downward, potential downward.
Yes.
That's correct.
let's try to change that
No,
in
that's a-
economic
that's a-
development and housing.
Well, I think the point is data is not destiny.
Right,
That's a good line for us to remember.
I'm counting on all of you to help me build more houses.
So, any more questions?
Thank you,
Yeah,
Paul.
that was
Yeah, that's
really
good.
helpful. You did for us what we needed. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We have
2:30.
2:30, so we have,
I know they're here. I sent them up eating cheese and crackers in the
um,
office down the hall.
what,
Northeast can't do it.
yeah, I know it's.
I love that Venn diagram. Everyone commit that Venn diagram. The greatest Venn diagram. His Venn diagram,
The overlapping,
Oh, yeah.
if you want your services and you want no housing.
See the one showing.
And
Doesn't work.
Yeah, and the thing is, I've spoken to folks who said, I think we provide too many programs.
Yeah, why don't we take a-
I'm
we'll
okay
take a-
with getting some things.
take a-
And that's fine. They at least picked a spot on the diagram that
Right.
gives it to middle.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Because we just can't be here.
Yeah, that doesn't exist.
We'll
And
take
it's
a
okay
break.
to have opinions on where we should
We'll
be.
start a little
Right.
early.